Okay. First, I'm just gonna say thanks, Cindy, for that quick introduction, and then I'll quickly introduce myself. I'm Joel Finnis. I'm one of the leads of the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice. Just while we wait for the last few attendees to sign in, thought I'd maybe take a quick opportunity to introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Amber Silver. We're fortunate that Amber has recently volunteered to join us as another lead on this particular community of practice. So I suspect you'll probably be hearing from her a little bit more over the coming weeks and months through the community of practice. But if you haven't had the pleasure of meeting Dr. Silver before, she does hold a PhD in Geography and Environmental Management from the University of Waterloo here in Canada, but for the last 2 years has been with the College of Emergency Preparedness, Homeland Security, and Cybersecurity at State University of New York's University at Albany. Now, her research interests center on decision-making before, after, and during, well, sorry, I should say before, during, and after, let's get the order properly sorted out here, critical weather events. But she's particularly interested in public attention to these events, risk perception, and communication for the purposes of proactive and protective action. Now, she's been doing some very interesting work in particular around the role of social media in this kind of decision-making and activity, and in particular, how this influences the ways that individuals obtain, interpret, and respond to official and unofficial warning information. Now, she's going to be presenting some of this work here today. Again, the title of this talk, Navigating the Changing Communication Landscape, Social Media for Risk and Crisis Communication. Maybe with that, I'll turn it over to Amber and let you get started. Thanks so much.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Dr. Finnis, for that very warm welcome, and thank all of you for attending this talk today. As Dr. Finnis mentioned, my name is Amber Silver, currently an assistant professor at the University at Albany, and I am delighted to be speaking about the role of social media for risk and crisis communication. So just a bit more about my background. I am a social scientist. I was trained in geography. I consider myself broadly defined as a behavioral geographer. My background has been in this intersection between weather and society. So given that my training was in Canada, a lot of my research is focused on Canada, of course. So I've done work on perception, preferences, and usage of general forecast information, but I've also studied some acute events, including the 2011 Goderich, Ontario tornado, as well as Hurricanes Michael and Florence in 2018. And currently, with Dr. Finnis, I'm working on some research on Hurricane Dorian and its impacts in Atlantic Canada. Now, broadly described, I would say that my research falls under decision science. I'm interested in the ways that information form and delivery influence decision-making and behavior. This has led me to my current research area, which has been the sort of focus of my research for the last 3 or 4 years or so, which is how social media is influencing this process of risk and crisis communication. So to give you an idea of what the next half hour or so will look like, I'm going to begin with a very, very basic introduction, talking about where we were and where we are now. I'm going to discuss these related notions of risk and crisis communication, and then I'll spend the bulk of my talk talking about the strengths and weaknesses of social media for risk and crisis communication in general, and also some tie-ins to disaster response and recovery. I have just one slide for my conclusions. I'll share with you all some relevant research that might be interesting to you, and then we'll come together for some questions at the end. So as we all know, rapid proliferation of new information and communications technologies has revolutionized the way that we communicate with one another. Communication in general, but how we communicate about risk in particular. So traditional sender-receiver approaches have been replaced with more collaborative, participatory, and multi-directional communication. And this is owing again to the development of these technologies such as the internet, mobile phones and mobile phone applications, and in the United States, wireless emergency alerts. All of these change how citizens are interacting with information. And of course, these changes have profound implications and notable challenges for emergency management. Now, although the terms risk and crisis communication are often used interchangeably, they are distinct in important and practical ways. So McComas provides an excellent definition of risk communication as an iterative exchange of information among individuals, groups, and institutions related to the assessment, characterization, and management of risk. So the overarching goal of risk communication then is to provide citizens with information about potential risks as well as strategies to reduce or avoid potential harm. So take, for example, flood hazards. Risk communication about flood hazards in a particular community might try to raise awareness about the probability of floods, while also encouraging the uptake of protective behaviors, so such as purchasing flood insurance or installing sump pumps and backwater valves. It can also discourage dangerous behavior, such as driving through flooded roads. So in this respect, NOAA's Turn Around, Don't Drown campaign is really a quintessential example of good risk communication. By contrast, crisis communication is often conceptualized as narrower in scope and refers to messaging about an ongoing or imminent emergency. It's therefore more urgent in nature, and there's more uncertainty associated with it. Crisis communication then seeks to explain a specific event, identify likely consequences and outcomes, and provide specific harm-reducing information to affected communities. And it aims to do so honestly, candidly, promptly, accurately, and completely. So using the floods example for crisis communication, it might look at things like informing citizens about evacuation zones and routes or the location of public shelters. It can also provide protective action recommendations such as avoiding approaching riverbanks. Now, early research on risk and crisis communication was predominantly sender to receiver oriented, or in other words, from experts broadly defined to citizens. Given the information and communications technologies available at the time, there was very little capacity for citizens to disseminate information about risks themselves, particularly during events, and there was virtually no collaboration between experts and citizens in the development of official warning information. So in many respects, citizens were viewed really just as passive receivers of information rather than active interpreters and creators. Now, I will caveat that statement by saying there was research done in the 60s and the 70s that acknowledged or embraced the role of citizens in creating new information, but the dominant trend or theme of the time really was this sender to receiver model. That's sure changed. So this narrow view, it persisted until about the mid-90s when advances in information and communications technologies began to influence ways that we communicate with one another, and not just how experts communicate to citizens, but also how experts communicate with one another, how citizens communicate with one another, and increasingly how citizens are communicating with experts. Now, this really changed following the invention of the internet and Web 2.0 specifically. So Web 2.0 resulted in the rapid proliferation of websites that allowed citizens to create, share, comment on, and like content. Now, these websites were described as social media, as opposed to traditional media, for their ability to empower people outside of the mainstream media realm to create and exchange content. So no longer are citizens passive receivers of information. Now, an average citizen is capable of becoming a powerful content creator as well. Now, I've organized my talk into some strengths and weaknesses. Here I have 9 general strengths of social media for risk and crisis communication in particular, and for disaster response and recovery in general. This is by no means an exhaustive list, and many of these items overlap and intersect with each other in complex ways. So first and foremost is how quickly information can be shared on social media. So not only can information it rapidly disseminate, but there can be a very large audience that it can be reached as well. So for example, research on the 2011 Tohoku earthquake discovered that the first tweet about the event originated 1 minute and 25 seconds after the slip. In other words, from the second the failure occurred to the time the shock wave traveled over 70 kilometers, to the moment someone first felt the shaking, to the time they picked up their phone, opened Twitter, composed a tweet, and hit send, took less than 90 seconds. That is incredible. And so it's the truth now that information can be disseminated very, very quickly during a crisis. And not only can it be disseminated quickly, but it can potentially reach a very large audience. So for example, this tweet on the right side of the screen was sent by Penn State's Interfraternity Council. It's actually one of the most retweeted tweets of all time. So this demonstrates not only that the information can travel very quickly, but the size of audience that that information can reach can potentially be very large. One thing I'll point out is that this, it's been retweeted over 1 million times, and retweeting is really important in the realm of crisis communication. As Dr. Sutton, a communications scholar at the University of Kentucky, explains, all things being equal, retransmitted messages are likely to be seen by a larger number of persons. They're likely to have been seen a larger number of times by any given person, and they are more likely to have been received from a personally known and trusted source than messages that are not transmitted. Thus, multiple exposures of a message are often associated with increased perceptions of veracity and confidence in that message. Put simply, the more often you see a message, the more often you read it, the more people who are saying the same message, the more you're going to trust that message. A third benefit of social media is as a tool for risk confirmation. Now, during crises, when crucial information is sparse, individuals experience a high degree of uncertainty. That's not a comfortable feeling. So to reduce uncertainty, individuals are going to seek out information. As you might expect, people just don't automatically accept information when it's first presented to them. So for example, if you receive a weather warning on your phone, say a tornado warning, chances are you're not going to shut off the computer and run to the basement with no additional inquiry. Instead, you're going to probably go to the NWS website, text your partner, do a Google search, something to verify that, yeah, actually the threat is real. This process of verifying information is referred to as risk confirmation. So social media is another avenue that people can use to verify information. And it also allows users to get a sense of what other people think about a weather warning. So for example, is it serious or is it being overhyped? And this leads into the next benefit of social media for risk and crisis communication, which is a tool for interpretation and sense-making. Now, as Dr. Stern explains, sense-making refers to the challenging task of developing an adequate interpretation of what are often complex, dynamic, and ambiguous situations. This entails developing not only a picture of what is happening, but also an understanding of the implications of the situation from one's own vantage point and that of other salient stakeholders. So consider, for example, if you find or if you hear that a hurricane is due to make landfall in your community. You're going to begin this process of searching for information to reduce the uncertainty that you feel. It's called milling, essentially. It's milling behavior. It's a very social process whereby you're searching for information, you're looking at what other people are doing, you're listening to how other people are interpreting the situation, and that's helping you understand what you're going to do. So how are people reacting? Are they preparing to evacuate? Are they battening down the hatches? Are they purchasing emergency supplies? Or conversely, are they making light of the situation? Are they cracking jokes and sharing memes? Are they criticizing or mocking forecasters or judging the quality of the forecast? Just consider this. If Jane Doe average citizen receives a forecast saying that a landfalling hurricane is about to occur in her region, but everything she reads and everyone she talks to is suggesting that the situation is not as serious as the forecast is making it out, chances are strong that this is going to negatively influence whether and how Jane Doe average citizen prepares. This is because sense-making and milling, more broadly, is an intermediate step between message receipt and action. Another potential benefit, as well as a potential challenge for social media for risk and crisis communication, is what I've referred to very broadly as SOS messaging. Now, during crises, when traditional communications channels are overwhelmed or have ceased functioning, citizens are increasingly turning to social media for assistance. Take, for example, Hurricane Sandy. At the peak of Hurricane Sandy, 911 dispatchers in New York were receiving over 20,000 911 calls per hour. As you can imagine, 911 very quickly came to capacity. It was to the point where when people called in, they either received a fast busy signal or a pre-recorded message to the tune of, thank you for calling, everyone's call is important, and so on. But they couldn't get through to a live dispatcher. And people in some parts of New York and New Jersey, they were desperate. People were stuck in their attics with the water rising. They hadn't heard from loved ones in a long time. They were concerned about. And so people needed to get through to their first responders. And so what they started doing was tweeting on Twitter at FDNY. And this woman by the name of Emily Rahimi, she was the FDNY's social media manager. She sat at her desk for over 30 hours, responding to tweets and then coordinating response of firefighters and first responders to help people who could not get through to 911 through traditional means. This trend of SOS messaging appears to be gaining traction, particularly on Twitter. So for example, when Hurricane Harvey affected Houston, Texas in August 2017, Twitter was inundated with tweets containing SOS-related hashtags, such as hashtag Harvey SOS, hashtag Harvey Rescue, hashtag People with Boats, and hashtag Boat Rescue. And this convention has been used in every major hurricane since Hurricane Sandy. So this image here is from Hurricane Irma, and it shows a tweet from someone who was trapped in an apartment building looking for help, and then a grassroots collection of volunteers started replying to these tweets using hashtag Irma SOS, inquiring for additional information, getting contact information, and putting individuals on lists to obtain assistance. Now, research has demonstrated that social media could act as a powerful and flexible platform to organize volunteers, as well as the donation of physical and financial aid, particularly in the aftermath of large-scale disasters. So in my research on the Goderich tornado, for example, I found that Facebook and Facebook groups played a crucial role in rapidly and effectively organizing citizen groups. So this image shows one such volunteer group. In the aftermath of a disaster, many private citizens, especially the elderly and lower income families, they simply could not afford to remove damaged trees from their property. So a Facebook group was founded to help these private citizens with this task. Essentially what you would do is that you would contact the group moderator. He would post your address and a date and time to the group, and then people would show up. They'd show up with chainsaws and trucks and safety gear, and they did so often in great numbers. Now, the citizens of this project indicated that Facebook allowed them to connect with one another even when they didn't share real-life social circles. In other words, Facebook was facilitating strangers helping strangers in the aftermath of a devastating disaster. Now, numerous researchers have identified the potential of social media as a platform to gather citizens' observations during a crisis. And this process is referred to as crowdsourcing or infovalence. Not only does crowdsourcing provide crisis professionals, so emergency managers and first responders, with information about current conditions and impacts, but it can also be used in different ways for emergency management. So you may or may not be aware, but many emergency operations centers, such as DISH's here in Albany, they actively scour social media every day to keep up to date on breaking news. And during activations, they're paying very close attention to what information is being shared, what trends they are observing. So for instance, what hashtags are being used, what users are relatively highly influential, what tweets are gaining the most traction, and so on. So this information that is shared on social media can be used to gain an understanding of the magnitude of an event. So how big is it? What are the impacts? Where are the impacts? Who's being affected? And this information can guide personnel and resources, and it can coordinate protective response. Crowdsourcing is also helping Environment Canada and the National Weather Service classify disastrous events. So for example, as many of you are well aware, tornadoes are ranked on the enhanced Fujita scale based on post-storm damage surveys, which correlate on-site damage to wind speed. Now, although storm damage survey teams endeavor to arrive at a scene of a suspected tornado in a timely fashion, it is simply not always possible. Canada and the United States are very large countries, and as I'm sure many people on this call will agree, not all Met offices are necessarily staffed or funded to a level that we would all prefer. So it is often the case that affected citizens have begun the process of storm debris removal and cleanup prior to the arrival of the storm damage survey team, thereby destroying important indicators of wind speed damage. Now, meteorologists and forecasters are increasingly relying on citizen-generated content, often shared through social media, to confirm whether a tornado has occurred. So, for example, is there video of the funnel on the ground? Is there video of debris flying around? As well as pictures of the damage itself. And they're able to use these videos and pictures to help rank the strength of the storm. And in this way, crowdsourcing is actually allowing citizens to aid in response and recovery efforts, whether directly or indirectly, as part of this sort of broader emergency management scheme. Lastly, I wanted to include this notion of collective coping. Research on the psychosocial experience of a disaster highlights the fact that people will engage in problem-focused coping and emotion-focused coping before, during, and after a disaster. Emotions that are often associated with coping include things like gratitude, anger, sadness, guilt, and of course, fear. Emotion-focused coping can also include things as having positive outlooks, seeking company and support, emotional suppression, the use of religion and faith, and wishful thinking. Now, after the 2011 Goderich, Ontario tornado, the downtown core of the community was absolutely devastated. To put this into perspective, Goderich is very proud of its reputation as Canada's prettiest town, which is what I believe Queen Victoria said when she viewed the community, however many years ago. So because of the tornado, the historic facades were damaged or destroyed, historic buildings like churches were destroyed, and abundant green space was lost. Citizens were absolutely dismayed by the loss of aesthetic appeal of their community. And so they turned to Facebook and Facebook groups as a way of seeking support and sharing their stories. They also used Facebook and Facebook groups to organize volunteer efforts aimed at re-greening or re-beautifying the community. One such group, called the Goderich Trees Project, fundraised money to replace trees that had been destroyed on public property. In fact, the loss of cherished green space had had such a negative psychosocial effect on the community, and the resultant greening of private property was so profoundly healing that the one-year monument to the tornado was actually a broken tree showing signs of regrowth and inscribed with the words, "Nature giveth and taketh away." So again, this was a very brief overview of some of the strengths of social media for risk and crisis communication in particular, and disaster response and recovery in general. But there is no discussion of social media for risk and crisis communication without talking about some of the very notable challenges. So I've listed 5 here. Again, this list is by no means exhaustive, including misinformation and gossip, overabundance of information, perishability of information, compassionate messaging, and compromising safety. So the issue of misinformation and gossip has been raised as a concern regarding the use of social media, basically since social media has been around. And this is particularly true during crises when uncertainty and urgency are high. Now, misinformation can be shared unintentionally. So for example, a user believes that the information is credible, but it is not. Or it can be shared maliciously. So in other words, a user is knowingly sharing false or misleading information. It is not difficult to imagine how the spread of misinformation or gossip could have profound implications for emergency management, whether the information is related to the event, its impacts, or recommended actions. However, inherent to this line of thinking is that old assumption that end users are passive recipients of information who will just automatically accept information that is presented to them, when in fact they are active interpreters. So there's been a lot of good research done by Brooke Fisher-Liu, by Jeanette Sutton and others that found that, yes, misinformation and gossip is a challenge and a concern, of course, but users tend to question, verify, and correct misinformation received through social media in what is termed as misinformation management or collective error correction. I saw this myself in my research on the Goderich tornado. In the immediate aftermath of the disaster, people were posting questions to a Facebook group asking about impact. So they were saying, I heard that the high school was destroyed, or my favorite, I heard that the Walmart was destroyed, that we won't have any more Walmart in Goderich. And immediately people were responding, saying things like, actually, I live across the road from the Walmart, the lights are on, cars are in the parking lot, the Walmart's fine. I think it is just something about human behavior that when we see something that we know is wrong, someone has made a mistake on the internet, that we are just compelled to correct them. Now, the effectiveness of misinformation management can actually be improved using a number of different strategies. One such strategy is the active engagement on social media by knowledgeable experts and community leaders during crisis events. Research on tsunami hazards, for example, found that misinformation and rumor proliferate more readily when there is a lack of engagement by professionals. My research on the Goderich tornado found the same thing, and in fact suggests that many community members desire and expect their local leadership, so in other words, local community council, forecasters, meteorologists, emergency managers, leadership broadly defined, they expect this leadership to engage via social media. Another strategy to improve misinformation management during crises can be found in ongoing risk communication efforts, and I really applaud the National Weather Service for all that they do in this regard. They frequently share infographics detailing how to assess veracity and credibility of information during severe weather. So this is an example of an infographic where they're just trying to get people to be good stewards of information. So on the far left column, some pictures are just fake and we shouldn't be sharing those as regards to severe weather at all. So no, the tornado is not sucking up the rainbow, and no, Cthulhu is not coming down from the heavens in an apocalypse. It's not happening. It's just plain fake. But sometimes images look real because they are real. They're just doctored. So in the center here, we have this one of my favorite pictures of an isolated supercell thunderstorm, just beautiful. But during Hurricane Sandy, the New York City skyline was superimposed on that image, and the image went viral. So again, just getting people to question information. And then lastly on the right here, these are real photos. They're just misattributed. So no, that's not a hail ball. That's a homemade hail ball. It's not real. And then the bottom photo, I'm sure one of the meteorologists on the phone can correct me. I believe it is a wall cloud, maybe a shelf cloud. It's a real picture, but people share it saying that it's a tornado. This NWS graphic is an example of risk communication strategy aimed at educating people at how to be good stewards of information. It also addresses another challenge with social media data, which is perishability. Information shared during emergencies, as we know, is highly perishable. Really, pick your disaster of choice. It could be a tornado warning, a flash flood warning. It could be an active shooter situation. 5-10 minutes is all the difference between there being an active credible threat for you and the threat having passed on. And so NWS is making great strides and doing great work trying to educate people about paying attention to what they're seeing, questioning information before they share it, and to pay attention to timestamps. Next is just the sheer volume of information. Now, in our daily life, we are inundated with information across numerous channels, and most of it we just tune out. We don't even realize how much information we choose not to pay attention to. Now, public attention refers to the process of noticing, selecting, and focusing on one or more external stimuli to which people are exposed. Research on public attention highlights the fact that attention is a finite resource, and there are a broad range of potential issues and events that have to compete. Secondly, the quantity of media that individuals can consume is finite, and therefore media consumption has an upper limit. And lastly, individuals select which information to pay attention to and which information to ignore. This is relevant regarding social media because of, for instance, Twitter, when you can have just thousands of tweets coming across your dock, in the matter of moments, eventually your capacity, your ability to actually take in new information is constrained. And so that is an ongoing challenge. Next is this really sad trend of compassionate messaging and challenges social media has for compassionate messaging. So you may not know this, but when someone dies unexpectedly, there is a process through which their family is notified. It's called death notification. So the notifier, usually an officer with training in grief counseling, will deliver the news in person as soon as possible. Now, unfortunately, because of our increasingly interconnected society, families are starting to find out about the deaths of their loved ones by social media and not through this process of death notification. We saw a really tragic example of this in Nova Scotia, Canada. An elderly man crashed on the highway on his way to work and was killed. As first responders were attending to the scene, they were basically marshaling traffic past the accident, but the accident was still in full view. People were taking pictures of the car and the carnage of the aftermath, and they were sharing it on Twitter and Facebook. A friend of the family, to the best of my understanding, a friend of the family found these posts and then contacted the family and said, is this so-and-so's vehicle? And this is how the family was notified. And as you can imagine, there are real repercussions for that in terms of psychosocial effects or repercussions, both short-term and long-term. Lastly, a real concern, an emerging concern for risk and crisis communication on social media is the safety of first responders. And we're not seeing this necessarily so much from a weather realm, more from the respect of mass shootings, active shootings, terrorism, and so on. So after the 2013 Boston bombing, social media was inundated with posts containing tactical information, such as videos and pictures of SWAT team locations. The Boston police actually had to tweet out to citizens urging them not to share tactical information as it could compromise the safety of their officers. And they were right to do so, because unfortunately we have seen increasingly that people who engage in mass shootings, or active shootings and terrorism in general are turning to social media, and they're paying attention to what people are saying. So they're able to see where the police are and where the police aren't. And it's becoming increasingly a concern. Now, another aspect of this has to do with digital vigilantism. So a social news aggregation website called Reddit was also involved in compromising the Boston bombing investigation. A subreddit was formed called Find Boston Bombers. Its goal or its motive was pure. The idea was that lots of people would come, they'd look through footage, look at pictures, and then try to find the culprits. Unfortunately, there is one individual who's incorrectly identified a 22-year-old man named Sunil Tripathi. The subsequent witch hunt resulted in the Tripathi family receiving hundreds of threatening and anti-Islamic messages. Tragically, Tripathi had actually committed suicide earlier that day. So in addition to a grieving family looking desperately for their missing loved ones, they were also faced with egregious harassment at the same time. The Find Boston Bombers subreddit also was a big challenge because it resulted in literally thousands of tips to the Boston PD. I mean, again, the motive was pure, but that meant that every single one of those tips had to be followed up on. It was an enormous strain for man hours and resources at a time when man hours and resources were absolutely critical. So again, social media is compromising safety of first responders and others in interesting ways. So with that, just quickly conclude. I know that was a very, very brief overview in about 35 minutes of all the pros and cons of social media. The one takeaway message that I would like to leave with you all is that social media is not going away. It doesn't matter who the top dog is in 25 or 30 years, short of basically an apocalyptic change in our society. Social media is here to stay. And so it is definitely within our best interest to try to figure out how to increase or improve all of the benefits of social media and to try to manage the challenges of social media as best we can for risk and crisis communication. For just a couple of recent publications that I'd like to bring to your attention. This talk was basically a summary of a book chapter I wrote called The Use of Social Media in Crisis Communication in Understanding the Roles of Risk Communication and Community Resilience Building. I've also written a paper on sense-making on social media, looking at tornadic events, looked at public attention to risk hazards and disasters, and then looking at the use of Facebook for information-seeking decision support and self-organization following significant disasters. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your attention today. I warmly welcome any questions or comments that you may have. I look forward to engaging in a dialogue with you.
Perfect. No, that was excellent, Amber. Thanks so much for that that informative presentation. We'll switch over now to the question section. If you have any questions, down at the bottom, if you move your cursor over the screen, you'll see a Q&A box down there. If you click on it, you'll have an opportunity to write a question in. Now, we do have a lot of participants today. We'll try to manage as many of these questions as we can, but we may not have time to get through all of them. Anyway, if you upload them, I'll communicate them, and we'll see if we can't get them answered. We do have one already. One of our participants here is raising a potential concern that we understand that we have some benefits from social media communication, that it can help with risk communication, but she's concerned that maybe there's a sense that everybody now has a cell phone, everybody now has a smartphone, and that this push towards using social media, and in particular using cell phones as a delivery mechanism, may be replacing some of our more traditional warning mechanisms and infrastructures, and points out that, for example, older members of the population who don't have a mobile phones or don't rely on these things, or people who are living in areas where signals are patchy, may as a result not receive warnings or evacuation advice. I wonder if you could speak to this particular concern.
I would be delighted. And first and foremost, what an excellent observation. I'm of the very firm school of thought that social media is not the answer to the be-all and end-all for risk and crisis communication. It is one tool in the toolbox. And during a disaster, it is really important to get that information out through as many channels as possible, because as the individual correctly noted, each platform has a slightly different user base. So the people who use Twitter are not necessarily the people who use Facebook, who are not necessarily the people who tune into the 5 o'clock news, who are not necessarily the people who are within, the radius of a tornado siren. So personally, I think it's really important that we get that information out through as many channels as possible, remaining, of course, consistent and transparent in terms of our messaging.
Excellent, thanks. So our next question then, Ryan's wondering, what best practices would you share with small communities, particularly those with some emergency services that are conducted by volunteers that can't necessarily be relied on 24/7?
Great question. That is a big concern. So it basically gets to the question of liability. So, if we start interacting with our communities on social media and then there's a disaster, it doesn't mean that, these channels are going to be moderated 24/7. And what does that mean if someone seeks out help and then they can't get it and so on? So in terms of best practices, I would say that one, as I mentioned, engagement with officials, broadly defined, has been really helpful both in facilitating trust and confidence in information, but also helping to manage misinformation. So I would encourage local officials, however that is defined within a particular community, to engage with citizens in general, but especially on social media if that's at all possible. I would also encourage them that during downtime, it's really important to interact with the community and to raise awareness of, or public education about, the fact that social media is there, it's a tool, it's not monitored 24/7, but good information can be shared through that, because the reality is that if you don't have that user base present during a disaster, it doesn't matter how great the information shared through social media is, it doesn't matter how readily it's available, if no one's reading it, then it's really not doing any good. So I'd say those two things for sure. One, get engagement through public officials, however you can, and two, try to raise that user base, raise awareness of the tools that you do have, it's well enough to let people know that these accounts aren't monitored 24/7, but when they are, it can be useful.
Great. So there's another question here that's just come through the chat as well. There's a question here about disasters that have a finite start period, something where we know that it's going to take place over a short period of time, versus something that's a bit more of a creeping disaster, something that lasts for weeks or sometimes months, such as a drought. There's a question here about how we might be able to use social media to communicate around not those short-term things, but those longer-term, protracted drought-like disasters.
Absolutely. So a lot of my research has looked at these very acute events with rapid onset and dissipation, but I am aware of some research that looks at some of these longer issues. It's really more in the realm of, I'd say it's more like a risk communication aspect, even though it is an ongoing disaster. And so I think that in that case, social media can be used as a platform to leverage public education, to leverage, again, that interaction between experts and citizens, and to encourage sort of ground up interaction as well. So trying to get citizens to engage with experts through social media during these more protracted events. So using the example that the individual used in terms of drought is one of those tricky hazards where there's not, it's difficult to say when the drought started, it's difficult to say when the drought ends. They're widely spaced, they cross political boundaries, they're often non-infrastructural in terms of their impacts. But through social media, I think that there's this opportunity when we engage with citizens to try to highlight some of the wicked problems, I guess, associated with drought. I hope that answers your question.
Excellent. If you do have any follow-up questions, feel free to send them our way as well. So another question through the Q&A here. There's some questions about whether you know of any good resources for mobilizing a social media monitoring team within something like an emergency management organization. Are there any guidelines out there for structure or operations or ways to manage this information?
I am delighted that you asked that. And yes, actually, we have quite a bit. So Dishes at Albany has, as I mentioned, this social media team. There's like 3 or 4 people, and then like a team lead who monitors social media. They have some really great resources. If you connect with me through email, I can try to send them out to you. But also, at the University at Albany, we are now starting what's called a Virtual Operations Support Team, or a VOST. So what we're doing is that we are hiring undergraduate students who are going to be working in a lab where they are getting training on how to monitor social media, how to crawl through social media, how to identify emerging trends or things of potential interest. And during activation, so when Dishes activates, so if there's like a big storm or if there's an active shooter or an industrial accident, they'll activate, and then the students will be in the lab at the same time, combing through various social media sites and coming up with these pithy little one-pagers that we can then send to Dishes as a sort of like a safety check to make sure that what we're finding is what they're finding, and that if in case there's anything that they missed out on, that we were able to find, that they don't lose out on that information. After the activation ends, the students are going to be working on what's called after activation reports, where they're analyzing the social media data, looking for trends, looking to see who was, these key stewards of information, what keywords or hashtags were being used, what tweets gained the most traction, and so on, as a way to sort of get lessons learned. What did we do right? How could we improve, so that during the next activation, we'll have that information and we'll be able to hopefully modify, the ways that we're using social media as a disaster response tool.
Excellent. So another question here. Can you talk about some common key aspects, or what should be included to make sure that your social media messages are particularly clear and to get the best population response? Is there some particular structure or content that we should make sure they include?
Absolutely. Dr. Jeanette Sutton has done fantastic research on this very topic. So what do we include in what is it now? 240, 360 character message to try to get through to people. And there's a couple of things that she has found that are really essential to include in your warning messages. So first and foremost is the source. Now, typically for NWS or the National Hurricane Center, they are the source. And so it's just by virtue of the fact that they're sending out the information, they know who the source is. Second is what the tweet is about. So is it a tornado warning? Is it a flood warning? To be very pithy. So don't just say public emergency or civil emergency. Second is to talk about who precisely is the target population. So if we're talking about a mass shooting, for example, I don't care that there's a mass shooting happening in Albany. I want to know what street it's on and what building it's on, or sorry, what building it is in. So I'd feel a lot better knowing that, there was a mass shooter at the state building than saying that there was a mass shooter in Albany. Secondly, we have to provide clear and concise action recommendations. So saying things like shelter in place, that's good, but it can be improved. So for example, for tornado warnings, you might want to say, seek shelter in the lowest, most interior room of your house, or seek shelter in a storm cellar, or whatever else have you. Let me see here. So who it's from, who it's targeting, what the threat is, recommended protective action, and time. So we want to make sure that, if we're talking about a severe weather event, when it is relevant, and then also when it ends. And you don't have to do that all in one tweet. So you could just say things like, pay attention for updates, or updates will be coming as, they roll out, or whatever else have you.
Great, thanks, Amber. So I've got a question here, and this one's a bit specific. Maybe I'm gonna branch out a little bit and speak to particular concerns that I have related to this. Jonathan's discussing his personal experience with using Facebook to communicate about particular risks, in particular persistent risks tied to, say, radiation leaking from the Fukushima disaster of 10 years ago, on Facebook versus Twitter. Now, Facebook allows you to have longer posts and longer discussion. Twitter favors these shorter communications, but then of course these two platforms also have very different algorithms and very different audiences. And as a result, he's got questions about how to best approach building trust with social media. Which platforms are best? Has there been much in the way of analysis of the relative benefit of shorter communications with wider reach on Twitter, or longer communications that may be filtered out of people's streams by shifting algorithms?
That is such an awesome question. So in regards to your second comment, has there been much research about various platforms? The reality is that most of what we know about social media is based on Twitter. There's very good reasons for this. It has to do with the ability to get data. Facebook is very, they are very reluctant to share their content with social scientists. They do not like to do it at all. It is very hard to get Facebook data. Twitter is very easy by comparison. Even Reddit and YouTube are pretty good. But just by the virtue of the fact that Twitter was one of the first platforms, and it was the easiest to get data from, most of what's been published on social media, well, perhaps not the most, but a sizable portion of what's been published on social media is on Twitter. To your first question, is there research that looks at the relative strengths and benefits of terse messaging for wider audiences on Twitter versus more in-depth messaging for directed audiences? There's been a decent amount published. Again, Dr. Sutton, I've said her name 1,000 times, but that's because she really is basically the expert on crisis informatics vis-a-vis Twitter. She's done some work on terse messaging, and so what that looks like, what are best practices, what components of messaging, of messages should we have, and so on. There's been less published, to my knowledge, about Facebook, and you're absolutely right to say that these are two very different platforms with different purposes. So Twitter really is like a microphone or a megaphone. It is intended to get information to a wide audience. That's not the purpose of Facebook per se. Facebook is much more personal. It's about networking. It's, you know, the development of Facebook groups and Facebook pages makes that a little bit more open, but not in the same way. I know of maybe 5, 6 articles that have been published on Facebook, my article being one of them. It's just the volume of research isn't there. Now, that's not to say that there's not research available on, you know, good risk communication practices and public engagement, but just not through the lens of severe weather and social media. That being said, and this is true for everyone who's on the call, if any of the things that I'm talking about, you're thinking, oh, wow, I'd really like to read that, please don't hesitate to email me. I'm delighted to share any resources that I have with you. And the same goes to this individual too.
Great. Yeah, I guess this ties into some concerns that I bumped into, and it sounds like it reflects what Jonathan's talking about, but also what our first question dealt with. I do sometimes worry that when we start relying on things like, private platforms like Twitter to get our messages across, that we're relying on a resource that might not be stable into the future, that might not exist 5 to 10 years ago, depending on what happens with Twitter as a company, or alternately, depending on how Twitter changes the way they behave. Has there been much discussion about that as a particular risk, the longevity of these communication avenues?
There has been, actually. And so when Facebook and Twitter first came about, there was a real reluctance by government agencies to adopt, you know, any sort of social media presence. And this is because there's concern about resources and resource constraints, but also that liability concern. But as I mentioned at the end of my talk, you know, eventually there was this understanding or realization that social media isn't going away, and it's how citizens want to communicate about extreme events, or how a subset of, you know, the population wants to communicate about an extreme event. So after X number of years, government agencies started coming online, figuratively and literally, warming up to this idea of social media presence. I think it's really important that we don't tie any resource or, you know, write any policies and procedures that tie risk communication or crisis communication to any particular platform. As you rightly noted, you know, we don't know if Twitter is going to be A, around, or B, amenable to this sort of messaging in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years. I think it's more important that we think about all of these platforms, just as I said, tools in a toolbox. If we already have the risk communication message developed, it's relatively minor effort to send that information out through multiple platforms, particularly if you're able to automate that in any way. So again, I guess just to summarize, I wouldn't be necessarily concerned whether or not Twitter is around in 10 or 15 years, because something will be there to take its place. And if we have adaptable and flexible policies and procedures, we should be able to just basically switch over to whatever new platform is, you know, popular at that time.
Excellent. Okay, well, maybe with that, then we'll just take a quick moment to remind you that if you're interested in this kind of event, CORC, the Coast and Ocean Risk Communication Community of Practice, you can find us online at www.corccop.com. That's just CORC COP. And I'd just like to take a moment again to thank our presenter, Dr. Amber Silver. That was great, very informative. That's given me a lot to think about, and I'm sure that's true for a lot of other people in our audience as well. And I'd also like to take a quick moment to thank Cindy Marvin, who was the person who started off this call and has been managing a lot of things in the background as well. Thanks to you both.
Thank you very much, Dr. Finnis, and thank you everyone again for coming to this talk. As I mentioned, please do not hesitate to drop me an email if you have any questions, if you'd like to follow up with additional discussion, or if there's any resources that I could send to you. I'd be absolutely delighted to do so.
Thanks so much.
All right, thank you everyone.